12 to 14, just like normal. It's just dog food.
See, I wish I had that.
No. I don't even know what it looks like at that age.
Maybe I should get it just to try the dog filter. Like,
You should.
and no, genuinely, it felt like it was detrimental to like I was like in junior high, like I didn't even care that I quit talking to other people. I was just like, I can't believe I can't do this stuff. No, exactly. No, I mean,
This is crazy.
Okay.
No. Oh my god. Look at that. Now all your things are great. So crazy.
oh my gosh, why am I so red?
I think it's just making you red.
Oh.
Like it's you do that little effect. You like running around the field chasing after the ball. Oh, that one was fun. Tell me you love that one.
Ooh. Whoa. Damn, why
These are all new. Stop watching.
I kind of like that.
Wait,
Like kind of, it gives you like a little.
hello? Like, why is this makeup actually at $1 million though?
Oh, I have it on already. All right. Okay, let's get started here. I am super smart. I just spent the last 2 minutes looking for the wireless microphone that I had already put on, because that's, man, I have to say, super smart of me to schedule 4 midterm exams in basically 3 days for the 4 classes or the 5 classes I have. That has been a lot of panicked student emails over the last few days and a lot of really stupid questions. None from you. You've all been perfect. Actually, this class has been really good. It was my SOC 100. What's the cutoff for the exam? Do we only cover things from week 3? It's like, no. There's been 4 weeks of the semester, so clearly everything. Come on, guys. Anyway, I love SOC 100. They're beautiful people. And yeah, it was a little chaotic yesterday with 250 people writing the exam and then having to line up to like sign out. It's like, there must be a better way to do this, but I simply cannot think of what it might be. And then people are like, oh, I didn't do well in the exam because there were people standing in line. And I'm like, okay, I got you. We'll work on the system. We'll come up with something or not. I don't know. Okay, so the upside of this is I've had far less time to work on stuff than I wanted to, especially my engineering class, the people in industry, where I had to enter all 100 of my possible multiple choice questions by hand into Canvas, which has been an experience of pain. Now, the really impressive thing is I only really screwed 1 up out of 100. So there was one question that made no sense because I copied an answer into the question part and then a bunch of responses. So that turned out really well. And I'm like, well, if you got that question, I will fix it later. So it's been an interesting week. How was your midterm? Good? All right? Do you hate me yet? No? Okay. I'm still your favorite? Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, you've had the advantage. You took like religion too. So the exams are basically exactly the same. Okay. So new topic for today. And here, I'm introducing this as families part 1 because I'm behind and I'm just kind of trying to put together the slideshows as I go. So in the past, I used to do like part 1, part 2, part 3, and then I moved to like a master slide system. But then I looked at my old master slides for families, and I was like, you're going to just take like 78% of these slides out and just start from almost nothing. So we're starting from almost nothing, which means I'm going to roll these out in parts, right? So everything that is in this slideshow we'll cover, and then we'll move to part 2, and then part 3, and then part 4. I don't know, actually. However far I get. We might only be 2 parts by the time we get there. So, okay. This is the Slido for here. If we ran out of time and didn't press submit, would our answers on the exam auto-submit? Yes, they will, in fact, auto-submit. Can I move my Grammarly somewhere else? Like hanging out right in the middle. Nope, it just wants to go to the top corner. Well, that's fine too. Yeah, it should auto-submit. You can send me an email and I can double check that everything's there. And if not, we can talk and we can figure out a way to fix it. When will we get our marks back? So do you want the honest answer or the like fluffy, hopeful answer? Honest? This won't be 3 weeks. You're first up in the queue because you were the first ones to write exams. And my goal is to mark like 20 of these a day. And there's 125 of you. So hopefully like a week or so, maybe a week and a half. That's my hope until, of course, the freight train of reality smacks straight into my face. I have a lot of downtime, like waiting for kids to do stuff. So like when I go out to horseback riding lessons or taekwondo or gymnastics, I'm hoping to just bring my iPad along and hotspot my phone and just be like, mark. Now this rarely works as well, or I'm half conscious because, parenting's hard. So we'll see. But I'm hoping for like a week and a half. I might come in on the weekend if I can convince my wife not to hate me for leaving her alone with my 3 children. If not, it might take a little longer, but we'll see. I'm hoping like a week and a half. And like I said, you get the engineers get to go last because they wrote last. So they get to go last, even though their questions are easier to mark. Okay, so I've got a poll for you. I want to start with this. And we'll come back to this, but I wanted to see kind of where you sit in comparison to sort of the statistics I have seen. So this is our question. Marriage is an outdated institution. 80% of you. Okay, out of 7. I'm intrigued, but it's stuck at 39 people. I'm cool with that. All right, I do want to go on. Maybe we'll check back on this in a minute, but this is interesting. Okay, so a little over a third of you agree that marriage is an outdated institution. I'm a little surprised that coming in at just better than a quarter is neither agree nor disagree. They're just like, whatever, I don't care. Disagree at 25% and strongly disagree at 8% and strongly agree. Let's say 41% of you either strongly agree or agree, and 33, so a third of you either strongly disagree or disagree. So that is interesting. We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so families. No, I'm kidding. I think we all know what families are, right? When we typically talk about, our common Western idea of the family, we're talking about, the nuclear family. This is our, parents, mom and dad, and kids, right? And typically, the idea of the nuclear family, married, and the kids are, biologically related to both mom and dad, right? Kid plus kid. Well, and probably not a third one for most people anymore. Okay, so this has been kind of the idea of the family in the West for a relatively long time, right? Certainly going back, to the Industrial Revolution, this becomes the norm, although you can make an argument, and I think it's a relatively strong one, that the idea of the nuclear family goes back to like the 13th century with the Fourth Lateran Council of the Church. Now, that's a bit of weird historical trivia that is neither here nor there. But this is the point at which, to put a fine point on it, the Roman Catholic Church banned what's called consanguineous marriage, or marrying your cousin. Consanguineous marriage. And from then on, right, you kind of married a stranger, right? Someone who was not part of your immediate family, or even your extended family, and you started to marry outside of your community, often people from neighboring towns and villages, and marriage in the West got really kind of interesting, which sort of kicks us into this idea, of a family, of the nuclear family as the norm. Now, again, this probably takes centuries to kind of fully distill through Western culture, but by the time we get to the Industrial Revolution, this is very much the norm, right? This idea of mom, dad, and kids, that's what a family is. Now, obviously, this has changed considerably in the last few decades. And if you want to go back and do a little bit of a history of marriage, right, basically, if you go back into kind of late antiquity, what you see is, by the time you hit like the 4th or 5th, about the late 4th, the late 5th, early 6th century, divorce is essentially banned, right? Divorce doesn't exist because of the Catholic Church again. And that'll remain the case at least until the Protestant Reformation, right, until the 16th century. So from like the 5th to the 16th century, basically divorce doesn't exist. And then you get, in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, and divorce becomes more possible, and very much, I think there's a movie coming out about his wives, a musical, I think, Henry VIII, right? Henry VIII, he is. He got married to the widow next door. He's been married 7 times before. Sorry, it's a little folk ditty. So Henry VIII, right, King of England, basically wants to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who he thinks is barren because she will not bear him any children. So he wants to divorce her because he wants an heir, and the Pope says no. So Henry's like, fine, I'll start my own church, wherein he starts the Church of England. And as the head of the Church of England says, hey, Henry, would you like to get a divorce? And he's like, sure, that sounds great, Henry. And then he grants himself the right to divorce, Catherine of Aragon. And then he marries a whole bunch of other times because this woman won't give him any male heirs. And this woman won't give him heirs at all. It might have been his infertility rather than anything else. And anyway, if you've ever been to some of the museums in London, one of the very amusing things about Henry VIII is his armor has an enormous cod piece. That's the piece that goes over his groin to basically be like he's got, big D energy, but he had a tough time fathering children. So that's weird. It's actually just really funny. It's like comically over large. And I just remember this. I have pictures of it from when I went to London because I was like, I gotta take a picture of this. This is hilariously oversized. Anyway, so divorce, in Protestant countries becomes much more normalized. And it's kind of 50-50, but it really takes off, following the 1950s, really into the 1960s in both Canada and the US, right? So in Canada, you get reforms to laws in Canada and the US at different stages. In Canada, the big change goes from, so prior to, hang on, I'm going to erase my stuff about Henry VIII, because I'm sure it's super relevant, and the Fourth Lateran Council, which I know is super interesting. This is what happens when you become an academic. You feast on trivia until you're overfull and can share it with your students. Are you looking up a picture of Henry VIII's armor and giggling?
No.
Okay. Maybe? Okay. That's funny. I should go find one and put it up on the screen. No, I got a highlighter. Fat fingers strike again. Okay. In Canada and the US, we have slightly different histories, but it's roughly around the same points that we get what's called no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce basically replaces fault divorce. That's not the legal term, But prior to no-fault divorce, right, what you have is that one partner or the other needs to prove one of two things: cruelty or infidelity. Right? So you have to prove one of those two things. Oh, actually, there's a third one: abandonment. Oops, I know how to write. Abandonment. So obviously, those conditions, they're hard to prove. Cruelty is hard to prove. Infidelity is very hard to prove. Abandonment is less hard to prove, but it's still rather difficult at times. And this obviously leaves mostly women in a precarious position at times of either staying with a husband who is hurting them, beating them or abusing them verbally, cheating on them, or has abandoned them and run off probably with some other woman, leaving them sort of stuck, right? He still has a sort of claim on them financially, but he's not there. So along with the women's kind of liberation movement and early feminism, you get revisions to the Divorce Act in Canada, and similar things happen in the US on a slightly different timeline, basically that allow divorce for physical or mental cruelty or after a 3-year period of separation, right? So making it much easier. And with the 3-year period of separation, you don't have to prove anything. You just have to prove that you've been separated for 3 years, which genuinely just means that you have to file a document with the court saying that you're legally separated, and then 3 years later, you can file for divorce. This is amended in 1985 under the Trudeau government, the first one. That divorce can happen after a year of separation without need to find fault with one party or the other. So it really simplifies the process. This kind of, in the US, this looks very different because a lot of this happens at the state level. And like, for instance, really New York State, right, didn't really get to this point of no-fault divorce until 2016. So it takes a little while. Okay, other things with families. So Canada, so obviously we've had a big change in family structures. In Canada, as of 2021, had about 10 million, a little bit more than 10 million families, 10,293,000 families. And the makeup of these families kind of shifts around over time. In 2006, about 34 or 35% of them were legally married with children. By 2021, that was actually up to about 41.8, and this is probably due in large part to immigration. Immigrants tend to have a higher percentage of intact families for the most part, right? And traditional kind of man, woman, and children families. So immigration is probably why we see a little bit of a jump in terms of the percentages. Blended families accounted for about 500,000 of the families in 2001. And 20 years later, it's essentially unchanged, right? We can see it on this little infographic from Stats Canada, right? It's about 500,000 two-parent step families 20 years later. So this percentage, though we tend to think, right, that family forms and remarriage and all of these sorts of things have changed a lot over time. Really, at the end of the day, they're kind of the same, right? They haven't really changed all that much. Oh, sorry, I maybe misread the stat. Two-parent non-step families in 2021 is 36.9%. So yeah, that number's wrong. That's total. That should be 36.9. I slightly misread this when I was looking at it, when I was looking at the stats. So it's only up like 2%, right? But it's up a little bit. Okay. 16.4% of our families in Canada are one-parent family, and it's like 92% of these are single mothers. It's like 92%. It's overwhelming. So this is, a little bit over 15% in Canada. In the US today, it's about 25% of families that are one-parent families. And again, overwhelmingly, you're looking at single moms. Okay, one of the big changes, we're going to talk about marriage a ton because, I'm on a, oh yeah, sorry.
Both parents considered like one parent family, like when they're sharing custody and responsibility.
So that would still be typically considered a one-parent family, right? And those arrangements are relatively rare. So like they're more of a rounding error than you might think. Most of the time, children will end up it's like 85% of the time, they reside principally with one parent, and then, have limited custody for the second parent, usually the dad, and it's usually like every second weekend or something, right? It's unfortunate, but yeah, the actual like 50-50 parenting arrangements are statistically kind of a rounding error. I don't know how big they are, but I know they're really, really small. But that's a good question. Now you distracted me and I don't remember what I was saying. Curse you. No. Yeah, it's probably some of the biggest changes come down to women having better economic prospects. Women are find themselves more free to enter and exit relationships rather than feeling stuck, right, in a kind of economic dependency to men that they maybe no longer want to be with for a variety of reasons, right? And as women's economic potential has increased, we've seen declines in marriage rates, some increases in cohabitation, but a big decline or a big increase in divorce rates, simply because women have more choices, right? It's not like you married the guy and you had his kids and now you're kind of stuck because he's got that one income that's supporting everyone. Okay. I actually want to go and see if there's any questions. Boo engineers. How does it work with marking? Is it alphabetical or first one to submit? I can choose whatever I want to do. But what I do is I actually typically select first one to submit, and then I put it on mark blind. So I can mark like student 1, student 2, student 3, so I don't see names. So I can't give preferential treatment, even though I don't know most of your names. I know some of them. So I try to be important. Okay, boo to engineers. They've actually been pretty good. I'm not gonna lie. They've been nice. We'll see how much they complain about their grades, because surprisingly, they didn't do as well as I thought they would, but I think some of them have been lulled into believing that sociology is easy, and I'm determined to prove them wrong. So, there's that. Am I not allowed TAs, or I don't trust them? Yes. I'm not allowed. I don't have a TA for this class. Also, I don't trust them. So, I had a TA last semester. It did not work out. Not for religion, for one of my other classes. It didn't end well. Okay, is it considered a single parent if your dad still comes back with milk and pays for uni despite only visiting 2 hours every day except for Sundays? No, we're talking about residents, like typically. Comes back with milk. That's a very strangely specific question. Okay. All right, we're still at roughly the same place. Okay. Man, I doodle a lot. Okay, we're talking about some housing arrangements, and then we're going to get into talking about marriage. By the way, I love this cat. I don't know why. His sweater makes me happy. Okay, so when we talk about our youth, right? Because we are talking about youth in this class, so I do try to keep the content as relevant to that as I can. In Western cultures, the expectation has been that you will leave home, when you become an adult, to kind of make your way in the world, right? This has changed a little bit in Canadian and US culture, especially as you've had a lot of immigration from cultures where kind of extended family arrangements and children living at home with parents for longer is not only sort of normalized, but often expected. I remember I had a student a couple of years ago, Lebanese, and her understanding was that basically she and her 6 sisters were all going to live at home with their parents until they got married, right? And only when they got married would their parents sort of allow them to leave, which I think I was like, are you okay with that? And she was like, well, I don't really have a choice. So I was like, okay. But typically, right, for most kind of people growing up in the West, you're expected to leave home, especially when you hit big milestones. So things like graduation and marriage have been really, really typical milestones for people to move out. Now, this is obviously changing, and we talked a little bit, in our generations unit about how the age at first marriage has been increasing really, since the 1950s. So now, increasingly people aren't, okay, we'll talk about economic challenges as we go, but people increasingly aren't leaving to get married. They're often leaving to live either alone or with roommates, peers. And increasingly, right, economic challenges mean that more young people are living at home for longer. My 15-year-old keeps threatening that she's going to live with us until she's like 30, and I'm like, no, please God, no. I love her, but no, just no. I want to turn her room into an office one day. My office is in the basement, and it gets cold down there. Okay, so the kind of phenomenon of young people living at home for longer, sorry, I just saw my comic and it made me chuckle. This one's having a little bit of trouble leaving the nest. It has been referred to by sociologists as the crowded nest. Basically, we had this idea of the empty nest, right? Your children become adults and they move out of the house and parents are left with an empty nest. Right, so there were always jokes about what particularly women do. They start a pottery studio in their house, or turn the kids' bedrooms into a crafting room or something like that. But increasingly, what we're seeing is what we would call the crowded nest. So we have a couple of different phenomenon in there. We have what are called boomerang children and Velcro children. Right. So boomerang children, we kind of described them, when we were talking about the millennials. They move away maybe to go to school, they move back, once they're done school, and they maybe move out once they feel like they're economically secure, and then hit kind of bumps in the road and move back in with their parents. So that's our boomerangs, right? Like a boomerang, right? They kind of come and go out and back, out and back, out and back. And then the Velcro children. The Velcro children obviously are the ones that are kind of stuck at home, right? And they're difficult to dislodge. This is my daughter's life goal, apparently, is to be a Velcro child, right? But they're staying home for longer. This thing where children leaving home and then returning once or several times is becoming increasingly common, especially as kind of post-college, they're struggling to be economically secure. Right? Okay, let's look at some numbers. So in 2011, 63.4% of males and 51.2% of females between 20 and 24 were living at home, up from 41% in 1981. Right? So again, this 2011 now is an old number. It's the most up-to-date number I could find. But we've definitely seen a big increase and a kind of jump in people living at home. Okay, 42.3% of the 4.5 million young people aged 20 to 29 live at home, right? In Canada, little change from 2006, but up significantly. That's 2011 again, from 1991, where it was a third, and 1981, where it was just over a quarter, right? So what we see, generally speaking, in terms of the numbers living at home is a pretty steady increase, right, over time. I just shot Robbie through the eye. I feel bad. I crossed out the bird. Okay. The highest proportion of young adults living with parents was in Ontario, right? Where almost half, or a little over half. The lowest shares were observed in Saskatchewan, the Yukon, and Alberta. And this seems to be mostly related to cost of living, right? The cost of living, as it goes up, so do these numbers. And Alberta and Saskatchewan have seen slower rises in the cost of living, especially around housing, than Ontario has. Okay, so more than 1 in 3 young adults, 20 to 34, were living with as many, or at least one parent in 2016, right? And that number has been going up since about 2001. So this is a slightly larger age range. Over the same period, the share of our young adults living with their own families, right? So they'd moved out and they have their own, partner and children, had decreased from about half, 49.1% in 2001 by, basically 8 points to 41.9 in 2016, right? So declining pretty sharply. I know you know what declining is, but I'm going to draw you an arrow anyway. So a smaller proportion of young adults are now living with children, either as part of a couple or lone parent family, and with or without their own parents present. And this has decreased basically from 33 to 33%. So fewer are living with children, their own children, declining from 32.9% to 25.5% in 2016, right? So fewer people are starting families and having children and living with those children. And yeah, data sources other than the census have shown the average age of a woman at birth of their first child has been rising for an extended period of time. Basically, right, when we looked back at the 1950s, the average age was about 22, and today in Canada, it's trending towards 30. So you're having children later and later, and we'll talk why in a second. More than 2 in 5, 42% young adults in Ontario were living with parents, by far the largest share, a proportion that had increased by 20% since 2001. And again, we're talking about, basically from the beginning of the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, until 2016, probably the period of one of the sharpest rises in housing prices. $, house, chimney. I don't know. My doodles. Oh, it needs a door and a window. Okay, 2 windows, actually. There we go. No, doorknob. Okay, right. The increase in the cost of housing is the big driver here. If your family went without you, there definitely would have been an empty nest. Sounds like from your comment, there would have been a burned down nest. That's very... Your friend's family went on family vacation and didn't bring your friend because he was 18. Suits, right? That's where Suits was filmed, was in Toronto. So it's Toronto Suits. That's what? No. Okay. So in Canada, of our biggest metropolitan areas, right, or census metropolitan areas, Toronto and Oshawa, right, had the highest shares of young adults living with parents. Almost 50% in both cases. Toronto, and again, or did I just repeat these stats? I did. Oops, my bad. Toronto and Oshawa were followed by 5 other metropolitan areas located in Ontario. Hamilton, I always think of Hamilton as Toronto, but I've told people from Hamilton don't feel that way. I once had someone who moved to Hamilton from Edmonton and described it as Edmonton, but with culture, which I wasn't sure how to take that exactly. He's kind of a snob, to be honest. Windsor, Barrie, St. Catharines, Niagara, and Brantford, right? All above basically 40%. And of the 4 other metropolitan areas with a population of 1 million or more in 2016, all had shares living with parents lower than the national average. So Montreal, Ottawa, Gatineau, Calgary, and Edmonton all had lower shares than the national average. So, Ontario, because it's so big and so expensive, tends to drag up the national average. And yeah, 70%-ish of those living at home reported never having left. Oh God, it's my daughter. That's what it is. Among those 25 to 29, the rate was 27%. Among those 30 to 34 was 8.6%. Okay, so obviously younger people make up the bulk of that share. Okay, so this is a word cloud. When should people consider getting married? And then I want to talk a little bit about marriage and some stuff. 25. Okay, interesting. You can put age or life achievement, like when you've accomplished certain things. 2,730 after post-secondary. After their partner pays off their student loans. So never is what I'm hearing. Money, career. After getting a secure job. When they find the right person. After getting a secure job is getting some love. Or is that the year, 2730? But I'm sure you mean between 27 and 30. At least $100,000 salary single or $150,000 combined. So I would have been like 41 when I hit that marker. Not going to say I didn't make good money, but certainly not 150,000 money. Okay, when they find the right person, when they're financially stable, when they are financially ready. So I'm seeing a lot of money when they are stable and both have their career jobs. Money, money, money. Emotionally ready. That's an interesting one. When you're ready to settle down with a monocle for some reason. Monocle, silly face. Okay. What?
Trust fund 605.
Yeah, trust fund 6'5". There are like 3 of those people in Canada. Like 3. Never. I'm bitter. Okay. For you, 30. Okay, interesting. All sorts of interesting things. That's actually not an uncommon answer. All right. So let's talk a little bit. So I want to talk about this. And a lot of where I'm getting this book out, or this information is out of this book, which I've just finished reading a little while ago. It's called The Future of Christian Marriage by Mark Regnerus. Now you're going to hear about Mark again in the course, because I love Mark. He doesn't know it yet, but we're best friends. One day he'll know. I really like Mark's work. Mark, I would say, is one of those sort of heterodox or against the grain sociologists that writes a lot of unpopular stuff. And so if you know anything, if you know me, I like the people who kind of like spit in the face of the other sociologists and are like, you're all stupid. This is my Rodney Stark streak for some reason. I love Rodney Stark and I love Mark, because Mark's more polite about it than Stark ever was, but Mark does the same kind of stuff. So this book obviously is about Christian marriage, but I think there's some really interesting things in it that apply kind of generally to marriage that we're going to talk about. We'll leave the kind of religious aspects out for the most part, and just talk about what is in this book that tells us something interesting about marriage in general, and especially marriage for young people. Because I think, in a lot of ways, it dovetails nicely with what I'll talk about later with Melissa Kearney's book, The Two-Parent Privilege. Both of them are of the very strong opinion that, and so I mean, if you look up Melissa Kearney's book, the subtitle of her book is How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind. Both of them advocate really strongly that marriage in general is a very positive social institution that, for whatever reason, has become very economically polarized. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through here. Okay, so who owns marriage? Well, generally speaking, no one, right? Marriage has a couple of different components, and you can sort of split, people's views on marriage between those who, are religious and view marriage in kind of religious terms, and those who are non-religious and view marriage in civil terms, right? So here, the most likely language that you would get is that marriage is a covenant, and here you would get the idea that marriage is a contract. So, kind of similar ideas, but, a little bit different. Now, most people, whether religious or non-religious, will treat the other kind of marriage as basically valid and interchangeable, right? So religious people will generally accept that people who get married civilly are in fact married, right? And people who are civilly married will view people who are religiously married as validly married as well. Now, from the standpoint of what people think about marriage, according to Regnerus, and I'll go back one slide. One of the really interesting thing about this book is that they did kind of both survey and qualitative interviews. So survey research and qualitative interviews in a whole bunch of countries globally. So they went to places like Mexico, the US, Russia, this was prior to the war, So they had, lots of things. Guatemala, Nigeria. There's a few others, and I think Poland was one of the big ones. There's a couple others that are just escaping me at the moment. But they did a pretty broad global kind of survey of marriage in Christian states, right? And states with like Nigeria that's kind of split between Christian and Muslim. So, Lebanon, that's the other one. Lebanon is one of the other ones. Again, a significant Christian minority, the big Muslim population there. So, this was a pretty kind of broad look at marriage. Oh, I should post those. Yes, I will post them. I just was working on the slides and forgot to post the reading. Okay, so in all of these places, right, when you ask people what marriages are for, they seem to serve a pretty old civic and protective kind of purpose, right? Marriage, is viewed as a place where children are cared for. It governs the ownership and inheritance of property, and it grants spouses sort of rights over each other, particularly in the case of incapacitation, right? They can act on behalf of the other person. And it seems to still be a fairly popular institution. They like it more than apparently the people in this class do. But in the 2018 American Political and Social Behavior Survey, about 2/3 of Americans disagree with the opinion that marriage is an outdated institution, right? So, here we had more neutrals. We had a lot more people saying neither agree nor disagree, and a little bit more, in the 40% range of people thinking it was outdated. So you're a little bit atypical of, say, Americans in 2018, but, kind of in the ballpark nonetheless. Okay, so how has it changed? So most of the people interviewed by Regnerus and his team seem to be of the view that the definition of marriage has not really changed, but a lot of people, or a lot of things kind of peripheral to marriage have changed, right? So divorce, the big one, divorce has surged. So there's a lot more people who have been married that are now divorced. Sex roles within marriage have changed significantly, right? Particularly with the expectation that men would take on a greater share of domestic responsibilities, right? And real, especially as earnings have become more equal between male and female partners, there's more of an expectation that, roles in kind of emotional care of children and domestic tasks are going to be more evenly shared, between the partners. I always say, I do 90% of the cooking in our family. And this is not so much because of shifting sex roles, it's because my wife is a terrible cook. Inedible bad. She makes substitutions that make no sense. Maybe. Anyway, this is the honest reaction of my children is what's for dinner? Oh, I don't know, mom's cooking. Oh. That's how it goes. Anyway, I'm not just being mean to my wife, but I am also doing that. Okay. The legal definition has also obviously been altered to include more people, and in an increasing number of countries globally, this is same-sex marriage. So more people having access and same-sex couples having the same rights as others. So obviously Canada was one of the early countries to do this in the early 2000s, but the US in 2015 with Obergefell v. Hodges, has sort of moved into that space as well. How am I doing for time? Oh, just the worst. Okay, so let's talk about the biggest change then. And this will give us a good jumping off point for next time. So the biggest change, according to Regnerus, and he's taken this terminology from another sociologist named Andrew Cherlin, is that marriage is now, and I think if you look back at the answers that you gave, back here, a lot of what you're seeing is exactly what Regnerus was talking about. Wait, did something... When they find a guy with a trust fund 6.5, I'm what was that one? Okay, I'm good. Okay, so marriage has changed from, it is now widely perceived as a capstone rather than a foundation. Okay, so what does this mean, right? Well, a capstone is kind of the top, the finishing touch of a structure, right? So when the structure's all built, you put the capstone on, and Regnerus defines this as a moment in time, right? Just one moment in time, that's where marriage comes. Versus a foundation, right? A foundation, and like you don't really need a capstone. A building can function perfectly fine without a capstone. It's a sort of decoration. For Regnerus, a foundation is essential, right? You need the foundation of a building to support that structure. If you don't have a good foundation, the whole thing falls apart. So a foundation is essential. A capstone is not. A capstone is an accessory. So when people are building their lives today, and again, your answers are very indicative of this. When people are building their lives, marriage is widely understood today as an achievement attained by each partner, not at the beginning of the construction of an adult life together, right? It's the sort of culmination of building your adult life and moving, then once you've, got your $100,000 a year job, then you can kind of think about marriage. And again, these are quotes from the book. Most no longer think, that should be think, that's a typo, think of marriage as a formative institution, but rather as the institution they enter once they are fully formed. I'm going to highlight the fuck out of that. Pardon my language, because I think that's key, right? Fully formed. I'm going to highlight it in another color over that highlighting just to emphasize it. There we go. Right? So marriage is something that people do once they are fully formed. This is broadly shared between religious and non-religious people across national borders. They found it all over the place. There were a few places like Nigeria where it was less present and where there was a sense that this view of marriage was a Western export. And yet it was still there. All right, and this is Mark's, I call him Mark because we're best friends, graphic from the book. So you can see the difference between a capstone marriage, right? So it's a symbol of successful development, status you build towards, right? Now, what do you get out of it? You get fewer marriages, right? Fewer marriages and later marriages, which I think, if we look at our marriage statistics from earlier in the course, from our generations model, that's precisely what we see. And an emphasis on psychological satisfaction. Marriage is all about making you happy, right? All right, versus a foundations marriage, where you get married earlier, more people tend to get married. The emphasis on the practical importance of marriage, especially, combining finances, providing stability, companionship, and all of that stuff. And yeah, people work with their complementary strengths to help accomplish goals, right? Here in the capstone vision, you work to accomplish your goals alone. And once you accomplish your goals, then you can get married. But here, you get married and then you work together, with your varying strengths to accomplish goals together. Okay, I think we're out of time, but we'll come back to talking about capstone marriage and its impact next time. There's lots to say. And I think as we saw, right, this is our dominant vision, at least of the people in this room, because you all sort of said things, or most of you said things that align with this vision of marriage. Okay, let's, is it bad if your partner is basically just your therapist? As long as your partner isn't literally your therapist, I guess that would be fine. Okay, we'll see you next time. We'll see you on Friday.
I think if you're in like a